Hello and welcome. My name is Retro, and today I will be doing a guide on the interworkings of the advanced systems behind the way damage works in this game. This video is aimed to tell experienced players exactly what different things they might be doing wrong when it comes to building weapons and how to better improve their weapons. If you're finding that you've just got into Steel Path and you for whatever reason, I've noticed that you do very little damage to Steel Path enemies and don't really know why, this video is here to help you. Even if you are a more experienced player and you do have builds that are doing quite good damage on Steel Path, this video is still probably worth a watch to better understand modding so you can go off and mod on your own. If you're someone that normally goes and copies other people's mods or puts generic mods on builds but doesn't really understand why, then this video is for you, even if you are doing Steel Path comfortably. This video is not for new players. We will be covering a lot of detail in this video that will probably go over the heads of a lot of new players. I have released a how to damage basics video, which goes over the basics of the damage system in this game, specifically targeted at new players. And I've also released a damage type explanation video where I go into detail about how damage types work in this game and the differences between damage types and their status effects, as they are different. Now, those two videos are what I would call prerequisites for this videos. So either you'll have to have gone and already watched those videos, or you already know the knowledge that is in them. So I will not be recovering any of the knowledge that is in those two videos, but both videos are important to get the most out of this video. Now, many people probably already know the information that are in those two videos, in which case you wouldn't have to watch them. But if you're not sure, it could be worth to watch them anyway. Especially the damage type video. A lot of players probably think they know how damage types work, but don't. The thing I hear constantly is people misunderstanding the differences between damage type and status effects, as damage type and status effects are not the same thing. Status effects are just related to damage types because they proc off a specific damage type. They are not the same and they have different effects, and this is a concept that seems to be misunderstood by a lot of people. So if you are confused by that, I would recommend probably going and checking out my damage type video. In this video, I will be covering and talking about what is additive and multiplicative damage. What do these two terms mean? Which one is better? How do you know if mods are being additive and multiplicative? I'll also be talking about primers. What does that term mean? How do you make a primer? What are primers used for? What's the point behind them? I will also be talking about Rivens and the importance or not importance of them. And I will also be going over specific damage setups that are the most popular damage setups in the game right now. I won't be showing any specific builds or even necessarily taking you through the building process. I will likely be making future builds that do that, but I will be showing you examples of damage setups and why you would use one over another. So let's get straight into it and let's talk about multiplicative versus additive damage. Okay, so what do I mean when so what do the terms multiplicative and additive mean? What do they refer to, and how do you know if mods are multiplicative or additive of each other? So to start with, if you would look at a weapon like this, here we just have my unmodded Kratos to show this example, we can look at all of its base stats, right? So these are all of the weapon's base stats. Whenever you put a mod on a weapon, like let's say Pressure Point, that mod then multiplies your base stats. They are a multiplier. Pressure Point, for example, increases our base damage by plus 120%. If you wanted to convert that into a multiplier, all you had to do was divide it by 100, giving you 1.2, and then add 1. Since it is plus 1.2%, you always have to add the 1 to the multiplier. So Pressure Point will multiply our damage by 2.2. You can see there the base damage was originally 200, and now it's at 440, which is 2.2. So what if I then wanted to add Spoiled Strike? Spoiled Strike also increases my base damage by 100%. And if Spoiled Strike is increasing which works out to be a multiplier of 2. So if mods that get put on a weapon multiply the damage each time when you put on the weapon, Spoiled Strike and Pressure Point together should give me around about 880 damage, right? Because we multiply the original 200 damage by 2.2, giving me 440, and then would then multiply that 440 by another 2, which would be 880, right? You can see that's not what's actually happened. I don't have 880 damage, I have 640 damage. Why? Because Spoiled Strike and Pressure Point are both what's called a base damage buff. This simply just means they buff the base damage of the weapon, this stat right here. And you know their base damage buffs because they say melee damage, or for a rifle it would probably just say damage. Serration is another example, right? Any type of mod that says increase your damage by X amount, that's a base damage buff. And what's happening here is instead of Pressure Point and Spoiled Strike multiplying the damage separately from one another, they actually combine together to make one single multiplier. So instead of you having a 2.2 multiplier and then a 2 times multiplier, we actually plus the 100% from Spoiled Strike and Pressure Point together, giving us 220%. And then to convert that into a multiplier, again, all we have to do is divide by 100 and plus 1, which will give us 3.2. So these two mods together give us a single multiplier of 3.2. This is what the term additive mods means. These mods are additive together, meaning when you put them on the same build together, they add together to create one single damage multiplier. Comparatively, faction damage mods, so for melee weapons, the Smite mods, or Bane for rifles, and so on, they give what we call a faction damage buff, also sometimes referred to as a true damage buff. Faction damage buffs is a different type of damage buff, and instead of it being additive with base damage buffs like Pressure Point, it works out to be multiplicative. So now, when we had 2 mods in 2 different mod slots, multiplying the damage a single time, now we have 2 mods in 2 different mod slots, multiplying the damage 2 times. Together, total. So we first multiply our damage by 2.2 from Pressure Point, and then we multiply our damage by 1.45 from Primed Smite. The faction mods are already in multiplier format, unlike other mods in the game. Now, you're probably wondering, if this is the case, why is my total damage number only at 440? Well, this kind of leads me to my next point. It's not necessarily related to multiplicative versus additive damage, but it is somewhat related. And that is that you shouldn't trust this number. The total damage number means nothing to you. In fact, if you mod in a way to specifically increase the total damage number, you'll likely end up with lower DPS than you would in a way that would end up with lower total damage. This is because many mods, such as this faction mod right here, don't actually affect this total damage number in the modding menu. We just put on Prime Smite Grenier and none of the base stats got changed. Does this mean this mod is useless? No, this mod is actually very good. The modding menu is just not designed well and won't show you what the actual stat will do. What are some other mods that won't increase the stats of the weapon? Well, there's actually many. For example, Berserker Fury. This increases my attack speed. Not showing on the menu. Blood Rush. This increases my crit chance. Not showing on the menu. Condition Overload. This gives me base damage, much better than Pressure Point. Not showing on the stats. Weeping Runes increases my status chance, again, not showing on the mod stats. These are all buffs that are dependent and situational on your circumstance, which is why they're not showing on the mod stats. But there are fixed buffs that will also just simply not increase your total damage number, but instead might increase something else. For example, crit damage. You do see crit damage increase your crit multiplier, but it doesn't increase your total damage. If you're critting, your total damage is more than what it would be, but it isn't shown there. If we use a regular Primed Fury, we can see that our attack speed is actually being buffed, unlike Berserker Fury. But that doesn't increase our total damage, even though an attack speed buff or a fire rate buff for ranged weapons is a direct DPS buff. And many other mods don't affect the total damage number, which is why you should never pay attention to the total damage number. You should never mod trying to increase the total damage number mod, because doing so will likely result in a bunch of additive mods. The way you actually want to mod is by putting on as many different buffs as possible. For example, Primed Fury, the faction mod, Primed Fury is an attack speed buff. The Prime Smite Corpus is a faction mod buff. And Organ Shatter is a critical damage buff. All of these mods are multiplicative. Why? Why are they multiplicative and Pressure Point and Spoiled Strike weren't? This is because whenever mods buff the same damage, buff the same stat, they are additive with each other. Another example of this would be True Steel and Blood Rush. Blood Rush at 12 times combo will increase your crit chance by 440%, while True Steel increases your crit chance by 120%. These two mods are both buffing your crit chance and are both additive with each other. Prime Fury, or any of the other Fury counterparts, and Gladiator Vice would also be additive because they both attack speed. Hammer Shot and Vital Sense, which are both crit damage mods for rifles, are additive with each other because they both buff crit damage. Hammer Shot is also additive with Rifle Aptitude as they both buff status chance. Elemental mods are additive with each other. Any mod that buffs damage in the same way is additive with each other. If they buff a different base stat, such as faction damage and base damage, as they're buffing different stats, they end up being multiplicative with each other. Now, what is better, additive or multiplicative? Well, I want you to, for a second, visualize these 8 mod slots as the number 2. I'll probably edit in a number 2 over each one. Now, imagine we're forming an equation. So at the end of it, we have the equal sign right here. And the end result of the equation, whatever the equaled number is a simulation of how much damage we're doing. We're going to then go and put a plus or a time sign in between each of these mods. And depending on which plus or times we're going to use, will be dependent on if we're using additive or multiplicative damage. So, as a quick example, we have this mod set up here. We can ask ourselves, is Berserker Fury and Blood Rush multiplicative? They buff different stats, so yes, they're multiplicative, we're going to put a times there. Is Pressure Point and Blood Rush multiplicative? Yes, they're multiplicative, so we're going to put a times there. Is Pressure Point and Condition Overload multiplicative? Well, they both buff base damage, so we're going to add a plus there. And then is our faction damage multiplicative with our base damage buff we get from these two mods? Yes, so we're going to put a times there. Now, I hope that basically gives you the gist of what we're doing. We're forming an equation with 8 2s, and we're either going to add those 2 together or we're going to multiply those 2s together. If you want to ask yourself what's better, additive or multiplicative, simply ask yourself which number is higher, the end result of 2 being added by itself 8 times, or the end result of 2 being multiplied by itself 8 times. Straight up, you can probably say immediately that 2 being multiplied by itself 8 times will be higher than 2 being added by itself 8 times. But just so you know exactly how much of a difference that is, 2 times 8, which is the same as 2 being plus added to itself 8 times, equals 16. While 2 to the power of 8, which is the same as saying 2 multiplied by itself 8 times, is 256. Even if you were to add a single additive mod, you would get 2 to the power of 7, 2 multiplied by itself 8 times, plus 2, which is 130, which is almost half of the last number. We can see how much adding additive mods to your damage setup can lower your DPS through this simulation. So yeah, additive mods aren't very good, and you should avoid them as much as possible. Sometimes it's impossible to avoid additive mods. For example, I mentioned elemental mods are additive with each other. Sometimes you want a mod for combined elements like viral, gas, corrosive, whatever. You have to use 2 elemental mods to make those elements, in which case those mods will be additive with each other. But that's okay because you're going for a specific element. So avoiding additive mods entirely is impossible, but you want to remove as much waste in your builds when it comes to additive mods as possible. This is why you won't see rifle builds using Serration, because the Acolyte Arcanes give a 360% base damage buff, which is much larger than what Serration offers, and Serration and the Acolyte Arcanes are obviously additive. This makes using Serration a wasted slot, because you could use that mod slot to give you an multiplicative damage buff instead, which will result in a much larger damage buff. So next up we have primers. What is a primer? What's the point behind them? How do you make one? How should you make one? Well, primers are pretty simple. Primers are typically alternate weapons, so not your main source of DPS, that isn't set up to do damage to enemies. What it is set up to do is simply prime enemies, hence the name primer, with a bunch of different status effects, debuffs to make enemies weaker and to then further buff your damage output. Primers can come in all shapes and sizes. Typically, secondaries have often been used to prime. Epitaph and Kuvenukor are very popular ones. These days, however, companions, specifically Sentinel companions, are very good at priming as well. But what's the point behind that? Why do I want to prime enemies with status effects? Well, there's two reasons. Number one, it's for mods like Condition Overload and their Guncio counterparts. If you don't know what I mean by Guncio, it is the galvanized mods that buff status chance that have the same alternate effect that is the same as the Condition Overload effect. What is the Condition Overload effect? Well, the way it works is it will increase the base damage of your weapon by 80% for every unique status effect on that enemy. If you had the status effects of all 13 damage types on a single enemy, that would work out to be a total of a 1040% base damage buff. Obviously, getting that many status effects is probably unreasonable, but you'll probably be likely getting 5 or 6, which will give you a much larger damage buff than other sources. The Guncio mods are even better, as on some mods they're even multiplicative with base damage. So that's the first reason why you want to be using a primer for weapons, because you'll be applying more status effects on the weapons, which will then buff them with the use of these mods. What's the second reason? Well, the second reason can be because you want the actual effect of the elements you're priming. For example, let's have a look at one of my Epitaph builds. This build works to prime enemies with viral, radiation, and then cold because Epitaph force procs cold. What's the point of this? Well, viral will increase my damage, which is by 100% against enemies' health on one proc, and it goes all the way up to 325% damage buff against enemies' health at a max 10 procs. And this is a multiplicative damage buff. So viral actually directly increases the damage buff against, directly increases the damage I'm doing against enemies. However, to be clear, viral is not doing this. This is because the viral damage type doesn't do that. The viral damage type can apply the virus status effect, which does that. Damage types and status effects are different. Cold is also then good because it gives me the freeze status effect, which comes from cold, gives me an absolute crit damage buff, and also slowing or even freezing enemies entirely. While radiation will apply the confused status effect, which makes enemies turn on each other, making cold and radiation together incredible crowd control, because enemies will shoot each other instead of shooting you, and they will be slowed, making their shooting fire rate slower as well, which will directly lower their DPS. So this setup can be used to be amazing crowd control, increasing your survivability, while also weakening enemies to your damage through the use of viral. This can be good for ability setups, and it can be also good for a very popular damage setup called Viral Slash. You can get rid of the viral on your main DPS weapon, as viral isn't doing damage on Viral Slash setups. Slash is doing the damage. Viral is simply just there to buff the damage from Slash. So the main DPS weapon doesn't need to do viral. You can offshoot the viral damage to a different weapon, a primer like Epitaph, or even have your companion prime enemies with viral for you. That way you free up 2 mod slots on your weapon for more multiplicative damage. Now, moving on to Rivens. People seem to be of the mindset that builds need Rivens to work, or a weapon needs Rivens to be good, or something like that. People really love Rivens, people think they're very good, and people do what they can to get Rivens for specific weapons. Rivens are scams. The only use Rivens have is on the market for selling them. They're very profitable when it comes to farming platinum. In terms of actually using Rivens on weapons, they're scams. Most weapons in this game aren't going to benefit from Rivens by a noticeable amount unless you have unless you have a god roll, a very good, not even a good roll, a god roll, the potential best possible roll you could get or close to. Unless you have a god roll, the Riven can probably be replaced with a different mod and will likely the weapon might even do more damage with the Riven. Or even if the Riven was buffing the damage, it wasn't buffing it to a noticeable amount that made the investment into the Riven worth it. Because the reality is, Rivens take a lot of investment. You either spend platinum by buying specific Rivens of specific god rolls for specific weapons, but that could likely cost you anywhere between hundreds or even thousands of platinum to get, depending on what Riven we're talking about and how good this rolls on the Riven is. Or even if you are buying a Riven from another player for a specific weapon you want, but it doesn't have good stats, you're likely to be dumping hundreds you're likely to be dumping thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands even of Kuva into a single Riven even, and never ever get a god roll. Of course you can get a god roll, but the odds are you're not going to. And quite frankly, the investment it takes to get that god roll that may never show up isn't worth it. Because you can make builds that are more than powerful enough to take out weapons, as we are already so overpowered even without Rivens, that the investment into Rivens was a complete waste of time and gave you pretty much no reward anyway. That said, if you wanted a Riven, obviously you should go get one. But there is no need to have Riven on builds, except for very specific circumstances. And 90% of the times, Rivens are just simply a complete scam. So, double dipping. What does the term double dip mean? Double dipping refer to a few different things, but the best example of what it means is how it works with status effects related to faction mods. But the short and the long of it is simply just that the buff affects happens twice. In the case of a status effect, faction mods double dip with it, meaning the faction mod affects the status effect twice. What happens is the faction mod will increase the damage of your weapon, the direct raw damage of your weapon, which damage over time status effects scale off. Then, when the damage over time status effect is being calculated with how much damage it does, the faction damage will be applied a second time directly to the status effect itself. So the status effect will get buffed from the faction damage once by indirectly through the weapon being buffed by the faction damage, and then it will be buffed a second time directly by the faction damage itself. So now that we've covered the basic terms of multiplicative, additive, primers, and also how Rivens are scams, let me go in and explain specific damage setups that are currently the most popular damage setups and when I would use a specific setup against others. I will also explain why I use specific damage setups over others. Just because I use this damage setup in a certain way doesn't necessarily mean you will use it the same way, but it's important to understand why I chose a damage setup over another, so you can choose what damage setup you want to use depending on the circumstances that you're going for. So I'll go in for. First of all, it is important to understand the difference between a raw damage setup and a damage over time setup, which is obviously often shorthanded to a dot setup, DOT, damage over time. Raw damage setups kill enemies with the actual raw damage of the weapon. The actual damage output of the weapon is being used to kill enemies. Raw damage setups are the kind of setups that you'll be seeing hitting damage numbers into the millions, even billions. Damage over time setups typically get lower damage numbers, still into the thousands, potentially even into the millions, but damage over time setups don't kill enemies with the actual damage from the weapon. What the weapon does is apply a set of effects that do damage over time effects. These effects, whether it be heat, electric, toxic, slash, gas, or kind of blast. These setups rely on the status effects damage to kill enemies, not the damage from your weapon. So there is a distinct difference there, and the way you mod the weapon and what damage types you use are different if you're going for a raw damage setup or a status or damage over time setup. So why would you use one or the other? Well, damage over time setups are better. They will do more damage, and they are also more universal. Raw damage setups typically have to be changed depending on what faction you're going up against. However, not every weapon really works with damage over time setups, as some weapons may have slow fire rate, bad status chance, or other factors that make it so that they don't proc status effects very effectively, making them ineffective by killing enemies with status effects. The most obvious example of this is obviously shotguns, but there are many other weapons that could fit into this category. These kind of weapons work and function better with raw damage setups instead. So how would you mod for a raw damage setup? Well, you would simply just mod with the basic mods. I won't go into too much detail about this because, like I said, I do intend to make a video that goes into a step-by-step guide on how you actually mod a weapon. But you just want the basic mods. You want to throw on as many multiplicative damage sources as you want. You want multi-shot. If you don't have multi-shot, it's a bad build. You want your crit damage, crit chance, assuming it has good crit chance and crit damage stats, which the weapon probably should, and you want your fire rate for ranged weapons, attack speed for melee weapons. You also want your faction damage as its multiplicative. And while raw damage setups do not care about status effects, you probably still, depending on the weapon, probably want to use the galvanized status effect mods anyway for the gun CO effect, as it does increase your base damage. And then obviously you want to use the damage type that is specific to the faction you're going up against. Now, what damage type you should use against every faction is simple. What you have to do is look on the map. The map tells you, for example, for Corpus, magnetic and puncture. Magnetic and impact, sorry. For Grineer, corrosive and puncture. Simply just look at the map and adjust your damage types accordingly depending on which faction you're going up against. Now, damage over time setups. What damage over time setups normally, while raw damage setups, you simply just want to mod for the damage type that the enemy is specifically weak to. Damage over time setups use more specific combinations. These combinations, the popular combinations being Viral Slash, Viral Heat, Blast Corrosive, and I'm also adding Viral Electric, which is a somewhat newer one and less used one. So, what are the benefits of these setups? Why would you use one over another? Starting with Viral Slash. The benefit of Viral Slash is the slash status effect, which is called Bleeding, does true damage to enemies, meaning it ignores enemy armor. This is what made Viral Slash so good before the armor nerf to enemies in Jade Shadows, because armor scaling was ridiculous and cut into our damage a lot. But now enemies are a lot weaker and armor is a lot less of an issue now, so Slash is also not nearly as good as it used to be. However, Slash is still a very good damage setup. I would probably only really use Viral Slash setups on rifles or on primary weapons. This is because they can make use of the mod Hunter Munitions. Hunter Munitions is very good because it applies the slash status effect on crit hits, meaning you don't actually need to mod for status chance, and your weapon doesn't even need to have slash on it. As unlike elemental damage types, you can't mod faction damage mod types onto weapons that don't already have that damage type. Meaning if a weapon doesn't have slash, you can't run a slash mod to give it slash. Hunter Munitions doesn't matter about that. You can have a weapon that doesn't do slash, and you can get slash, the bleeding status effect, from Hunter Munitions. This makes it very good. This makes Viral Slash work particularly well on primary weapons. Then we have Viral Heat. So Viral Heat. You're probably hearing the name Viral very often. Why are we using Viral, Viral Slash, Viral Heat, Viral Electric? Viral simply just increases the damage that the damage over times, slash, heat, and electric do. As I already said before, that's what the Viral status effect was. You don't actually need to mod Viral on the weapon itself. You can offshoot it to another weapon, a primer, a companion, to free up mod slots on the weapon. Viral Heat pretty much has a very similar principle as the Viral Slash one. Heat is your damage over time. It will deal damage to enemies and work very well. Heat is specifically good because it scales very differently to most other damage types in the game and uses something called Heat Inherent. I won't explain what this does in this video because I already explained it in my damage type video, and if you haven't watched, so if you want to know what that is, you should watch the damage type video. Viral Heat works specifically good on secondary weapons because of the Arcane Cascadia Flare, which gives a damage buff for applying heat status effects, and the base damage buff it gives is higher than the base damage buff you get from the normal Acolyte Arcanes. I think it's around 440%, something like that. It's definitely above 400%, I just don't know the exact number. Then we have Viral Electric. What's the benefit of Electric over Slash and Heat? Well, the benefit of Electric is that it is an AoE. Not only will apply damage over time to the enemy that it is inflicted by, but it will also do damage over time to any enemy within range of that enemy. This obviously makes it scale very, very well with enemies, as the more enemies that are clumped together, the more damage it will do. Viral Electric works specifically well on melees because of melee influence. You already need to use Electric to trigger melee influence, so simply just using a Viral Electric build on melee weapons is enough to wipe out pretty much most enemies, because Viral Electric is quite good these days after the armor nerf. Electric suffered from issues against enemy armor before the armor nerf, but since enemy armor is much weaker now, Viral Electric will whip through enemies, and it works extremely well on melees because of melee influence. And then we have Blast Corrosive, or even just Blast with really good weapons. Why is Blast Corrosive so good? Blast is another AoE damage type just like Electric, and it's even better because of the way it works. Again, I won't go into detail because I already explained the specifics of the Blast status effect in my damage type video. Do watch that if you want to find out more. But the issue that Blast has is it will suffer a bit from enemy armor. Fortunately, you can actually modify Blast and Corrosive on a single weapon. Though you can and then have a primer use viral if you wanted to get the viral damage buff as well. Or you can of course put corrosive on another weapon or primer if you wanted to. It's also important to note that with 2 green shards, corrosive will fully armor strip enemies. And then Blast will be applying a full AoE explosion within I think 6 meters. That makes it very, very powerful and will trigger multiple of these AoE explosions on every enemy that it afflicts it on over and over again. Viral Blast setups works best on weapons that can apply status effects very quickly, like any type of beam weapon, like the Torrid for example, or the Teneglaxon. Blast doesn't work as well on slower firing weapons or even fast firing weapons that aren't beam weapons because the power of Blast comes from being able to apply a lot of Blast status effects very quickly after one another. So if you aren't using a beam weapon or a very fast applying status effect weapon, Blast is probably not going to work as well. So that is all I have for this video. I do hope you found it informative and that this video helped you with understanding some of the stuff you may have been getting confused by with modding. And some of the stuff in this video are definitely things that a lot of players don't quite understand as it was never really explained to them. And if you did enjoy this video, please consider leaving me a like and subscribe, and also leave me some comments and tell me how you enjoyed the video and some other stuff, and maybe you have some video requests and suggestions for me. And also consider checking out some of my other videos as you might like some of them as well. Anyway, until next time, bye bye!